In 1922, a British archaeologist pried open a sealed doorway in the Valley of the Kings and found a room packed floor to ceiling with gold that had not seen daylight in over 3,000 years. That discovery made headlines around the world. But it is not the gold that has kept scientists arguing for the last decade. It is one wall, a single painted wall, 4 meters wide, standing at the north end of that same burial chamber that a group of researchers became convinced was hiding something behind it. What they found when they finally tested that wall with radar, and what they did not find, is one of the strangest science stories to come out of Egypt in the last 100 years, and it still is not fully settled. The tomb in question is called KV62. That designation simply means it was the 62nd tomb catalogued in the Valley of the Kings, on the west bank of the Nile across from the city of Luxor. It was discovered on November 4th, 1922 by Howard Carter, an archaeologist who had spent years searching the valley with financial backing from Lord Carnarvon, an English aristocrat who had all but run out of patience and funding by the time Carter's crew found a single step carved into the bedrock. That step led to a staircase. The staircase led to a sealed door stamped with royal insignia. And behind that door was the tomb of Tutankhamun, virtually untouched since it was sealed around 1323 BCE. Tutankhamun himself was a minor figure in the grand sweep of Egyptian history. He became pharaoh as a child, somewhere between 8 and 10 years old, and died around the age of 19 after ruling for roughly 9 or 10 years. He is not remembered because of what he accomplished. He is remembered because his tomb survived. Almost every other pharaoh's burial in the valley was looted in antiquity, stripped of its gold, its jewelry, its furniture, sometimes even its mummy. Tutankhamun's was not. When Carter's team cleared the 4 small chambers of KV62, they cataloged more than 5,000 individual objects: chariots, weapons, wine jars, model boats, a folding camp bed, and at the center of it all, 3 nested coffins, the innermost carved from solid gold, holding the mummified body of the boy king himself. That much is not in dispute. It is thoroughly documented, extensively published, and has been re-examined by generations of Egyptologists using tools Carter never had access to, from CT scanners to DNA sequencing. What has been in dispute, sometimes bitterly, is a much stranger question. Was this tomb actually built for Tutankhamun at all? Egyptologists noticed something odd about KV62 almost from the moment it was opened. Royal tombs in the Valley of the Kings tend to follow a predictable architectural pattern. A long descending corridor, several antechambers, a substantial burial chamber, all cut on a scale appropriate for a reigning monarch, and typically begun the moment that monarch took the throne, so the tomb had years to be excavated and decorated properly. KV62 does not fit that pattern. Its 4 rooms are small. Its layout is compact in a way that Egyptologists associate with tombs built for queens or high officials, not kings. And the artwork inside shows clear signs of having been finished in a hurry. Analysis of the burial chamber's painted plaster found brushstrokes and pigment application consistent with rushed, almost hasty work, the kind of thing you would expect if a burial had to be prepared on a tight deadline rather than over the span of a decade. There are a few ways to explain that. The most straightforward explanation, and the one most Egyptologists accept as the baseline, is that Tutankhamun died unexpectedly at 19, probably before a proper royal tomb befitting a king could be finished, and that his court repurposed a smaller tomb that had originally been intended for someone else, most likely a high-ranking noble or official, and adapted it for a royal burial under emergency conditions. This alone is a widely accepted, well-supported theory and does not require anything exotic to explain it. Sudden royal deaths in ancient Egypt were not rare, and repurposing an existing tomb under time pressure has precedent elsewhere in the archaeological record. But in 2015, an Egyptologist named Nicholas Reeves, a respected scholar who had previously served as a curator at New York's Metropolitan Museum of Art, proposed something considerably more specific and considerably more explosive. Reeves had been studying a set of ultra-high-resolution laser and photographic scans of the tomb's walls, produced by a Spanish company called Factum Arte, which specializes in precision digital replication of historic sites. Looking closely at the scans of the north and west walls of the burial chamber, Reeves identified what he described as faint, linear features running beneath the painted plaster, straight lines that did not match natural cracking or settling in the rock, but instead traced the outline of what could be sealed, plastered over doorways. Based on those observed lines, combined with his analysis of the tomb's cramped layout, its rushed decoration, and the way its corridor was angled, Reeves proposed that KV62 was originally cut and prepared not for Tutankhamun, but for someone else entirely, Queen Nefertiti. His theory held that Tutankhamun's burial only occupied what had originally been designed as an outer corridor or antechamber of a larger tomb, and that behind the sealed and painted-over north wall, an earlier burial chamber still existed, undisturbed, containing the remains of Nefertiti herself. Reeves's argument was built on more than just the wall lines themselves. He pointed to two separate features he believed pointed the same direction. A possible second sealed opening on the west wall, which he interpreted as leading to a storage annex of the kind commonly found in other royal tombs of the period, and a subtle deviation in the angle of the tomb's descending corridor, a construction quirk he argued was more consistent with tombs built for royal women than with those built for kings. Taken individually, none of these observations would have been especially newsworthy. Taken together and packaged with the missing queen narrative already surrounding Nefertiti, they formed a theory specific enough and dramatic enough to be tested rather than dismissed outright, which is exactly what Egyptian authorities chose to do. To understand why this idea captured so much attention, it helps to understand who Nefertiti actually was, because her story is genuinely one of the strangest in ancient Egyptian history, independent of any wall. Nefertiti was the great royal wife of the pharaoh Akhenaten, who ruled Egypt from roughly 1353 to 1336 BCE. Akhenaten is remembered as one of the most radical rulers in Egyptian history. Early in his reign, he abandoned Egypt's traditional polytheistic religion, closed the temples dedicated to the god Amun, redirected their wealth and priesthood, and promoted the worship of a single deity, the Aten, represented as a solar disk whose rays end in small hands reaching down toward the royal family. He relocated Egypt's capital from Thebes to a newly constructed city called Akhenaten, today known as Amarna, built from nothing on a stretch of desert roughly halfway between Thebes and Memphis. The city was raised at astonishing speed, planned with wide processional roads, open-air temples. Death. Amarna was abandoned, its temples dismantled, its stone blocks reused as filler in the foundations of later buildings at Karnak and elsewhere, and Akhenaten's name was left off the official king lists compiled by later dynasties, effectively erasing him from Egypt's own recorded memory of itself. Modern Egyptologists only reconstructed the outline of his reign in the 19th and 20th centuries, piecing it back together from the very monuments that had been broken up and buried as building rubble. Nefertiti appears constantly in the art of this period, and not as a background figure. She is shown at a scale equal to her husband on temple walls, something almost unheard of for a royal wife in Egyptian art up to that point. In one relief from Amarna, she is depicted smiting an enemy with a mace, an image that in earlier and later Egyptian art was reserved almost exclusively for the reigning king. Historians generally agree that during the middle years of Akhenaten's reign, Nefertiti held a level of religious and political visibility that went well beyond the traditional role of a royal consort. Then around year 12 of Akhenaten's roughly 17-year reign, her name and image largely stop appearing in the official record. For a long time, the standard explanation offered by Egyptologists was that she had died or fallen out of favor. That reading has been challenged by more recent research into the succession that followed Akhenaten's death. And this is where the story gets genuinely complicated, because the evidence is incomplete and the scholarly community remains divided. In the years immediately following Akhenaten's death, the historical and archaeological record shows a co-regent or successor ruling under the name Unkeperure Neferneferuaten. For decades, many Egyptologists assumed this figure was a previously unknown male relative, possibly a son of Akhenaten by another wife, serving as a transitional ruler before Tutankhamun took the throne. But closer study of the inscriptions bearing this name turned up something unusual. Several of them are paired with a feminine epithet that translates roughly to effective for her husband, a phrasing that in Egyptian grammar specifically marks the ruler using the title as female. Combined with other evidence, including apparent continuities in artistic style and titulary with Nefertiti's known iconography, a substantial number of Egyptologists, though not all, now argue that Unkeperure Neferneferuaten was Nefertiti herself, and that rather than falling from favor and dying in obscurity, she may have ascended to rule Egypt in her own right as pharaoh, either as Akhenaten's co-regent or immediately after his death, before Tutankhamun's reign began. This identification remains genuinely debated within Egyptology. Other candidates have been proposed for the identity behind Unkeperure Neferneferuaten, including Akhenaten's eldest surviving daughter, Meritaten. The evidence on both sides relies heavily on fragmentary inscriptions, damaged cartouches, and stylistic arguments rather than a single decisive text. And honest scholarship on the period tends to present multiple competing reconstructions rather than a single confirmed answer. Part of what makes this so difficult to untangle is that Akhenaten's successors, once the traditional priesthood regained power, had strong political motives to blur exactly this kind of record. A queen, or co-regent, who had presided over the dismantling of Egypt's traditional religion was not someone the restored priesthood of Amun wanted remembered clearly, whatever her actual name or gender turned out to be. Cartouches from this transitional period show signs of having been recarved and reassigned more than once, sometimes converting one ruler's name into another's, which is precisely the kind of evidence that makes reconstructing a clean timeline so difficult, and precisely why serious Egyptologists tend to hold their conclusions about this period more loosely than the tidy version people encounter in documentaries. What is not seriously disputed is that Nefertiti held extraordinary power during Akhenaten's reign, that the years following his death remain one of the murkiest and most contested periods in Egyptian royal history, and that if Nefertiti did rule as pharaoh, her eventual burial has never been definitively located. That unresolved question, where was Nefertiti actually buried, is what gave Reeves' 2015 theory its power. If she did rule as pharaoh, Egyptian custom would have required a burial appropriate to that status in the Valley of the Kings with full royal funerary rites. No such tomb has ever been found under her name. Reeves' proposal offered, for the first time, a specific physical location for that missing burial, hidden in plain sight behind a wall that millions of tourists had already walked past. Reeves published his theory publicly in August 2015 in a paper titled The Burial of Nefertiti. It spread through international media within days, and the Egyptian Ministry of Antiquities, under pressure from global attention, authorized a series of non-invasive scans to test the claim without damaging the tomb's painted walls. The first scan was conducted in November 2015 by a Japanese radar specialist named Hirokazu Watanabe using ground-penetrating radar equipment. Watanabe reported detecting what he interpreted as void spaces behind both the north and west walls of the burial chamber, along with signals he attributed to metallic and organic material inside those voids, the kind of signature you might expect from an undisturbed royal burial. Egypt's then Minister of Antiquities, Mamdouh Eldamati, told press at the time that officials were more than 90% confident hidden chambers existed. The story became a global sensation. Then came the second scan. In April 2016, a separate team supported by the National Geographic Society conducted an independent ground-penetrating radar survey using different equipment and methodology. Their results did not replicate Watanabe's findings. The geophysicist who analyzed the data, Dean Goodman, stated plainly that if a void of the size proposed had actually existed, the radar should have produced a strong, unambiguous reflection, and it simply did not appear. The two surveys contradicted each other, and for roughly 2 years the question remained genuinely open, with Egyptian officials publicly divided over which result to trust. To settle the matter, the Ministry of Antiquities commissioned a third and far more rigorous investigation. Beginning in early 2018, a team led by Francesco Porcelli of the Polytechnic University of Turin, working alongside two independent geophysical survey companies, Geostudi Asti and 3D Geoimaging, scanned roughly 1.6 miles worth of wall surface inside and around the tomb, using multiple radar frequencies and cross-checking their results against one another, before combining them into a single analysis. In May 2018, at the 4th Annual International Tutankhamun Conference in Cairo, Porcelli presented the team's findings to Egypt's Minister of Antiquities. Their conclusion was unambiguous. The report stated, with what they described as a very high level of confidence, that the hypothesis of hidden chambers or corridors adjacent to Tutankhamun's tomb was not supported by the radar data. There were no voids. There was no doorway. The wall, according to the most careful and comprehensive scan yet conducted, was simply solid limestone. That announcement effectively closed the specific claim that a hidden chamber sits physically behind KV-62's north wall, at least as far as radar can determine without physically opening the wall itself. Zahi Hawass, Egypt's former antiquities minister and one of the country's most prominent archaeologists, was blunt about it afterward, arguing that if any partition or masonry existed behind that wall, ground-penetrating radar of this sophistication would have shown it clearly, and it did not. Reeves did not abandon his theory after the 2018 result. In 2019, he published a revised version of his argument, focusing less on the radar evidence and more on the artwork itself, specifically the painted scene on the north wall depicting the opening of the mouth ceremony, a ritual in which a pharaoh's successor symbolically reanimates the senses of the deceased king so they can eat, speak, and see in the afterlife. In the version of this scene painted on KV-62's north wall, the ceremony is being performed by Tutankhamun's successor, a pharaoh named Ai, shown wearing the blue war crown that signifies him as a reigning king rather than a subordinate priest. Reeves argued that faint traces beneath the visible paint suggest the scene may originally have depicted a different pairing of figures before being altered, and used this as fresh evidence for his broader theory about the tomb's layered history. This revised argument has also been closely scrutinized, and the response from other specialists in the field has largely been critical. A detailed peer-reviewed critique published in 2021 by researcher Dave Lightbody in the Journal of Ancient Egyptian Architecture examined all three categories of evidence Reeves has offered over the years: the surface irregularities on the plaster, the art historical reinterpretation of the north wall, and the radar data itself, and concluded that, taken together, the evidence weighs heavily against the hidden chamber hypothesis. Other researchers who worked directly on subsequent conservation and imaging efforts inside the tomb through the Getty Conservation Institute have similarly found that the wall's painted scenes are best explained as depicting Nefertiti's genuine historical role and legacy in the succession, rather than as evidence of a concealed physical space behind them. As of now, the mainstream position within Egyptology is that KV62 does not contain a hidden chamber holding Nefertiti's remains, and that whatever the tomb's unusual layout and rushed construction reveal about its history, they do not point to a second, undiscovered burial sealed behind that specific wall. So, does that mean there is no mystery left at all? Not quite, and this is the part of the story that tends to get lost once headlines move from hidden tomb discovered to hidden tomb debunked. The wall itself has been resolved, as far as current non-invasive science allows. But the underlying historical puzzle that made Reeves's theory so compelling in the first place has not been resolved even a little. Nefertiti's final resting place remains genuinely, officially unknown. No tomb bearing her name in any form, male or female titulary, has ever been discovered and confirmed. That is a real, well-documented gap in the archaeological record for one of the most powerful and visible royal women in Egyptian history, and it exists independent of anything to do with Tutankhamun's tomb. There have been other candidates proposed over the years for where her remains might actually rest. In 2003, English Egyptologist Joanne Fletcher proposed that a mummy discovered in a side chamber of a different tomb, KV35, and informally referred to as the younger lady, could be Nefertiti herself, based on physical features and the style of a wig fragment found nearby. That identification generated significant excitement at the time and was covered extensively in the press. It has since been strongly contested. Subsequent genetic testing conducted by Egypt's Supreme Council of Antiquities in 2010 found that the younger lady mummy was, in fact, both a full sibling and the mother of Tutankhamun, based on DNA comparisons with Tutankhamun's own remains. Nefertiti, as far as the historical record indicates, was likely Akhenaten's principal wife, but not established as his full sibling, which makes the genetic profile of the younger lady difficult to reconcile with a confident identification as Nefertiti specifically, though debate over her exact identity and over the interpretation of ancient Egyptian royal DNA studies more broadly has itself continued among specialists. In short, the younger lady is almost certainly a close royal relative of Tutankhamun's, but whether she is Nefertiti remains unproven and disputed rather than settled. Part of the difficulty is that royal marriage patterns in this specific branch of the 18th dynasty were unusually close even by Egyptian standards, which were themselves more permissive of sibling and half-sibling marriage among royalty than most other ancient cultures. That means a DNA result showing a sibling relationship does not automatically rule out other identities the way it might in a more conventional family tree, and several specialists have pointed out that the 2010 study's methodology and its assumptions about which mummies belonged to which named individuals have themselves been questioned by other geneticists working with ancient DNA. None of this resolves the identity of the younger lady in Nefertiti's favor. It simply means the door has not been fully closed on every possible candidate, even as the specific KV62 hidden chamber theory has been. What all of this leaves us with is a genuinely rare situation in Egyptology. We have overwhelming evidence that Nefertiti existed, that she wielded extraordinary religious and political authority during one of the most disruptive periods in ancient Egyptian history, and quite possibly that she ruled as pharaoh in her own right after her husband's death, a level of power matched by only a small handful of women in 3,000 years of Egyptian monarchy. And at the same time, we have no confirmed burial, no verified mummy, and no tomb bearing her name that has survived to be found. The most technologically advanced non-invasive search for her remains, aimed at the most obvious candidate location, has come back conclusively negative. That is not a small footnote. In an era when radar, CT scanning, and DNA analysis can locate voids the size of a doorway behind solid rock and identify family relationships from 3,000-year-old bone fragments, the complete absence of any trace of one of history's most famous queens is its own kind of anomaly, even without a secret door behind a painted wall. It is worth sitting with why this particular case became such a global sensation in the first place, because it says something about how archaeology moves through the modern world. A single scholar's opinion on a preliminary, non-peer-reviewed hypothesis built on a real and interesting observation that faint lines on a laser scan resembled the outline of doorways became international news within days was tested by 3 separate scientific teams, using increasingly sophisticated equipment over the course of 3 years, produced 2 contradictory early results that fueled years of speculation, and was ultimately closed out by a rigorous, transparent, and largely uncontested final study. That entire arc, from provocative idea to public excitement to competing data to a carefully documented conclusion, is not a failure of science. It is closer to what real science actually looks like when it happens in public, under intense scrutiny on one of the most famous archaeological sites on Earth. The north wall of KV-62 is still there today, still painted with the same scenes Carter photographed in 1922, still visited by thousands of tourists a year who walk past it toward the golden sarcophagus without knowing any of this debate ever happened. As far as the best available science can currently tell us, there is no hidden chamber behind it. There is no reason to believe Nefertiti's remains are sealed inside Tutankhamun's tomb. But the woman herself, her true power, her possible reign as pharaoh, and the location of her actual burial remain one of the most significant open questions in ancient Egyptian history. Somewhere in Egypt, if her body survived the collapse of the Amarna period and the later attempts to erase her husband's religious revolution from the record, an undiscovered tomb may still be waiting. It almost certainly is not the one everyone has spent the last decade staring at, but that only means archaeologists are still looking in the wrong place. Not that there is nothing left to find. There is also a broader lesson buried in this story that has nothing to do with radar or wall plaster. Nefertiti's disappearance from the official record was not an accident of poor record keeping. It was, at least in part, the product of a deliberate later effort to smooth over an uncomfortable chapter of Egyptian religious history, one where a queen may have held the throne outright, and where the traditional priesthood had been sidelined for the better part of 2 decades. The fact that modern science, armed with radar and DNA sequencing, still cannot say with certainty where she ended up says less about the limits of that technology and more about how effective that ancient erasure actually was. Whoever ordered her name struck from monuments and her image chiseled off temple walls did their job well enough that 3,000 years later we are still trying to reconstruct the outline of what they removed. That is ultimately the real discovery hiding in this story. Not a secret room stacked with gold, but a reminder of how fragile even a pharaoh's memory could be once the people in power after her decided she was better left forgotten. Tutankhamun is remembered today precisely because his tomb was never rediscovered by looters and never disturbed by rival kings trying to erase him. Nefertiti's fate appears to have gone the opposite, direction entirely, deliberately obscured while she was still relevant enough to threaten someone's version of events. The wall at the north end of KV-62 was never going to hand back that history for free. And now that the radar has spoken, archaeologists are left exactly where honest historians usually end up, with a fascinating, well-documented life, a strong circumstantial case for real power, and a body that history simply will not give back yet. If you want to understand ancient Egypt beyond the headlines, beyond the version that gets simplified for clickbait, subscribe and stick around, because this channel exists to walk through exactly this kind of evidence, carefully, honestly, and all the way to the end. There are more royal mysteries in the Valley of the Kings that are far less settled than this one, and we are going to keep digging into them, one wall, one scan, and one contested inscription at a time.